No one ever doubted Margaret Langford. She was the kind of woman who turned HOA meetings into grand events, crisp white shirts, pearl earrings, and a smile that could slice through gossip before it began. Willow Creek trusted her, admired her, and maybe feared her a little too. For years, Margaret ran the neighborhood like a flawless orchestra. Every lawn perfectly trimmed, every mailbox identical, every complaint settled before it reached a whisper. To outsiders, she was the gold standard of leadership, elegant, charitable, composed. But inside her immaculate home on Sycamore Lane, behind curtains drawn just right, there was a boy, Ethan. Her adopted son. He appeared one spring morning 3 years ago. No one knew where he'd come from. Margaret only said she'd taken him in after a distant family tragedy. She never elaborated, and Willow Creek never asked because Margaret's word was law. Ethan was polite, quiet, and hauntingly beautiful for his age. Pale skin, soft brown eyes, and a strange, adult sadness in his face. He never caused trouble, but he also never smiled the way kids his age should. Neighbors adored the image, the powerful HOA president raising an orphan, saving a life. It made her seem even more saintly. But beneath her perfect exterior, Margaret's hands sometimes trembled when she brushed his hair. Her gaze lingered too long on his face, her eyes wet with something only she understood. And that was the first crack in her flawless world. It started with a small whisper, at first, nothing more than idle chatter near the mailbox cluster. "I heard Ethan's father might still be alive," said Mrs. Pearson, the neighborhood gossip-in-chief. "Alive," another neighbor gasped, but Margaret said the parents died in a car crash. "She said that," Mrs. Pearson replied, leaning closer. "But last week I saw a man standing outside her driveway at night, tall in a gray coat, just staring at the house." The rumor spread faster than lawn fertilizer in spring. By the next HOA meeting, half the board was buzzing with quiet speculation about Ethan, about that man, and about what Margaret might be hiding. Margaret noticed the shift. The smiles that once greeted her now held curiosity. The questions during meetings carried a new sharpness. And when she walked Ethan to school, she could feel the stares, heavy, sticky, judging. One morning, as she dropped him off, a man across the street lit a cigarette and watched. His eyes met hers, cold, knowing, and filled with something she couldn't place. She froze for a second before driving off, heart pounding. That night, she sat by Ethan's bed long after he'd fallen asleep. The boy's hand clutched a small wooden toy car, old, worn, and far too personal to be a random gift. She whispered, "You don't remember him, do you?" Ethan stirred but didn't answer. Tears rolled down her face. Margaret Langford, the woman who ruled every inch of her neighborhood, suddenly looked powerless. 2 days later, the man in the gray coat showed up again. This time in daylight. He waited outside her gate as she returned from the store. Margaret froze, groceries in hand. He stepped forward slowly, removing his sunglasses. "Hello, Maggie." Her breath caught that voice, that name. No one called her Maggie anymore, not since him. She swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel." He smiled faintly. "I could say the same, but then again, you took something that belonged to me." Her face paled. She looked toward the window. Ethan's silhouette was visible, playing in the living room. Daniel followed her gaze. "He looks like his mother, doesn't he? But that jawline, that's mine." "Stop," she whispered, trembling. "You gave up your right years ago." He stepped closer. "I didn't give him up, you stole him." Her fingers clenched around the grocery bag. "He was abandoned. She left him, Daniel. She couldn't raise him. You weren't there." Daniel's eyes burned with quiet fury. "And you think that makes him yours?" Margaret's composure cracked. "I gave him a life, a home, everything he never would have had." "Because you wanted to erase me," he cut in, voice sharp as glass. She turned away, shaking. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You never will." When she looked back, Daniel was gone. Just vanished down the street. But his words stayed. "You wanted to erase me." That night, Margaret tore through old boxes in her attic, faded photos, papers, the adoption forms she'd forged with trembling hands, every lie sealed in perfect ink. She stared at a photo of Daniel, years younger, arms around her, both laughing like life was simple. And beside them, another woman, Claire, Daniel's ex-wife, the real mother. Claire had begged Margaret to help when the baby was born. Margaret had promised only to watch him for a few weeks, but Claire never came back. The police later said she'd vanished after a mental breakdown. No trace, no goodbye. Margaret told herself she did the right thing. That raising Ethan was noble. That love justified everything. But now Daniel was back, and the walls of her perfect world began to close in. The next day, Daniel attended the HOA meeting. Uninvited. The moment he entered, the room turned silent. Margaret froze behind the podium, her speech halfway through. "Evening," Daniel said casually, taking a seat in the back. "Hope you don't mind, I'm considering buying a house in the area." Margaret's throat tightened. He sat through the entire meeting, never speaking, never looking away. When it ended, he approached her quietly. "Nice speech," he said. "You still know how to command a room." "What do you want from me?" she hissed. "Not from you, from him," Daniel said softly. "He deserves to know who he is." "He's my son," she whispered. Daniel's eyes darkened. "No, Maggie, he's my blood." For the first time in years, Margaret Langford had no answer. The next week felt like slow collapse. Daniel started showing up everywhere, at the school drop-off, at the park, even volunteering at the neighborhood's fall festival. People loved him instantly, charismatic, charming, funny. And the more he smiled, the more Margaret's power began to slip. Neighbors whispered that maybe Daniel should join the HOA board. That maybe Margaret wasn't as perfect as she seemed. She felt it all slipping away, not just her control but Ethan's love. One evening, she found Ethan sitting on the porch steps, holding a baseball Daniel had given him. "He said he knew my mom," Ethan said innocently. "Is that true?" Margaret froze, her pulse raced. "He said she wasn't dead." Her heart dropped. "Ethan," she whispered, kneeling, "don't listen to him, okay? Some people say things they do mean." "But he showed me pictures." Margaret's hands trembled. "Pictures of who?" "Of me," Ethan said quietly. "When I was a baby, with him and a lady who looked like me." Margaret's world went silent. Then Ethan asked the question she'd feared for years. "Mom, who am I?" Her lips quivered. "You're my son, that's all that matters." But Ethan's eyes searched hers with a look that broke her soul. He didn't believe her. That night, Margaret sat alone on her porch, the air thick with silence. The neighborhood she once ruled felt foreign now. Lights flickered behind blinds, whispers floated through the dark. She could almost feel the judgment crawling through every picket fence. And in the distance, Daniel stood by the oak tree watching. He didn't need to speak, his presence was enough. He was taking back everything, her power, her peace, her son. Margaret clenched her fists, whispering to herself, "No, I won't lose him." Then she got up, went inside, and locked every door. Because tomorrow, she would do something she promised herself she'd never do again. Something that could destroy them both. At dawn, Margaret drove out of Willow Creek for the first time in months. She followed the old highway to a secluded town, to a crumbling nursing home hidden by trees. Inside, in a dimly lit room, an old woman lay motionless, her breath shallow. Margaret stepped closer, whispering, "Claire." The woman's eyes fluttered open weakly. "Maggie." Margaret's throat tightened. "He's back, Daniel found me." Claire blinked slowly. He always would." "I can't let him take Ethan," Margaret whispered, voice breaking. "He doesn't understand, you couldn't raise him, remember? You asked me to protect him." Claire's frail hand reached out. "Protect him from yourself, Maggie." Margaret's face froze. Claire's eyes glistened with tears. "You took him because you wanted Daniel back. You said, if I disappeared, he'd need you again." "No," Margaret whispered, stepping back. "That's not true, that's not." Claire smiled faintly, a ghost of pity in her face. "He was never yours to fix." Margaret's voice cracked. "You left him, you left both of us." Claire coughed weakly. "And you made sure I never came home." Silence fell like a stone. Margaret's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" Claire closed her eyes. "You know." Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks as she turned and fled the room, the truth clawing up from the grave she'd buried it in. When she returned to Willow Creek, Daniel was waiting on her porch, a folder in hand. "I went to the county records office," he said coldly. "You forged the papers, you faked the adoption." Margaret's lips trembled. "I saved him." "You stole him," Daniel said, stepping closer, "and now he knows." Margaret froze. What? He's at my place, Daniel said. He wanted answers, I gave them to him. Her knees weakened. No. He wants to stay with me for a while, Daniel continued. He said he feels safe. Margaret's voice broke. He's my son. Daniel's eyes softened for a moment, almost sad. No, Maggie, he's our consequence. And with that he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing on her perfect porch, surrounded by her perfect lies as her perfect world finally began to crumble. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. Because if she couldn't keep Ethan through love, she would keep him through something far darker. And that's when the real story began. The house felt emptier than it ever had. Ethan's room, spotless, silent, still smelled faintly of his shampoo. His drawings still clung to the walls, his sneakers still sat by the door, but the boy himself was gone. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at his unmade bed. The clock ticked louder than usual. Every sound in the house felt like an echo of him. For 3 days she hadn't heard his voice. 3 days since Daniel took him. 3 days since her life began collapsing in slow motion. The neighbors whispered now, not just behind her back but in front of her. At the morning mail pickup she heard them. She's lost it, Mrs. Pearson muttered. Heard the cops came by. Something about forged papers, another replied. Well, she had to have done something. Nobody hides a child for that long unless there's a reason. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't look at them. She just walked past with her mail pressed against her chest, letters she didn't read, bills she didn't care about, HOA forms that no longer mattered. Her world, the perfect machine she'd built, was rusting away. Daniel's house sat just down the hill, a modern 2-story with a blue door and trimmed hedges. From her upstairs window, Margaret could see them, Daniel and Ethan, in the backyard. They were laughing, playing catch. The sound pierced her like a knife. Each toss of the ball was a reminder of what she'd lost and what she could never admit. That part of her had always wanted Daniel back more than she wanted Ethan safe. She watched for hours frozen. Ethan smiled in a way she hadn't seen in years, wide, free, unburdened. It was beautiful. And unbearable. When night fell she finally turned away, but she didn't sleep. Because as the moon rose, so did something inside her, a desperate resolve, trembling but fierce. She told herself it wasn't madness, it was love. And love in her mind justified everything. The next morning she drove to the school early. She waited by the parking lot as the children arrived. She wasn't allowed near Ethan anymore. Daniel had made sure of that with a restraining order filed just hours after the confrontation, but paper meant nothing to her heart. When Ethan stepped out of Daniel's truck, Margaret's breath hitched. He looked different, lighter, happier, but also older somehow, like the world had shifted for him overnight. She whispered through the glass, "You're still my boy." But Ethan didn't look her way. He walked with Daniel toward the gate, their hands brushing. Margaret's nails dug into the steering wheel. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She started the car, drove off, and didn't realize until minutes later that she'd passed the school entirely and was heading toward the county archives. The building was gray, windowless, and smelled of paper and dust. Margaret moved quickly. She knew what she was looking for. Birth records, adoption files, missing persons reports. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the folders until she found it, Claire Morgan. The report stated she'd been declared legally dead after 7 years missing. The case had been closed, cause presumed suicide. But something caught her eye, a note scribbled in the margin. Unconfirmed sighting near Lake Marin, 2019, no follow-up. Lake Marin. Just 2 hours north. Margaret's mind raced. If Claire was alive, truly alive, everything she'd done could unravel. Her heart pounded as she whispered to herself, I can fix this before Daniel finds out. And for the first time, her fear began turning into something darker, intent. That evening, Daniel found an envelope on his porch. Inside, no return address, no note, just a single photo. It was Ethan, age 2, in Margaret's arms. And behind them, faint but visible, stood a woman's shadow at a window. Daniel frowned. He didn't recognize the silhouette, but something about it chilled him. He called Margaret, against his better judgment. She answered immediately. You shouldn't be calling me, she said, her voice brittle. "What is this photo?" Daniel asked. "Who sent it?" She was silent for a moment, then softly, "Maybe someone's trying to remind you that you don't know everything." "Where are you, Maggie?" "Someplace you'll never have the courage to go," she said and hung up. Daniel's gut twisted. He didn't know what she was planning, but he knew Margaret Langford. When she lost control, she became unpredictable. And when she was unpredictable, she was dangerous. By the next day, she was already on the road, a duffel bag in the passenger seat, the wind whipping through her open window. The highway stretched endlessly. Every mile she drove, the past replayed in her head: Daniel's laughter, Claire's pleading eyes the night she'd made her choice. "Just take care of him for a while, Maggie," Claire had said, trembling as she handed her the baby. "Please, I need time." But Margaret had already made up her mind. She wasn't just taking care of Ethan, she was keeping him. Now, years later, she was driving to erase the last witness who could expose her. When she reached Lake Marin, the sun was sinking behind the water, golden and calm. She parked near a small, weathered cabin tucked behind the trees. The door creaked open before she knocked. Claire stood there, alive. Her face was thinner, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes, those same gentle, broken eyes, widened in disbelief. "Maggie." Margaret's voice trembled. "You're supposed to be dead." Claire gave a faint, tired smile. "You made sure people thought I was." Margaret stepped forward. "You don't understand what I had to do. I gave him everything. I loved him when you couldn't." "You loved his father," Claire said softly. "Ethan was just the piece of him you could keep." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Her lips quivered. "I saved him from being nothing." "No, Maggie," Claire whispered. "You saved yourself from being alone." The air between them thickened. Years of lies, guilt, and unspoken truths hung heavy in the silence. Margaret's eyes flickered to a framed picture on the table: Claire, Daniel, and Ethan as a baby. A family she had dismantled with her own hands. Something inside her snapped. She reached into her bag, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Sign this," she said coldly. Claire frowned. "What is it?" "A confession, saying you gave me custody willingly, that you never wanted him back." Claire shook her head. "I won't sign that." "You will," Margaret hissed, stepping closer. "Because if Daniel finds out you're alive, he'll never forgive you for leaving him. You'll lose him all over again." Claire's voice cracked. "He deserves to know the truth." "And Ethan," Margaret demanded, "you destroy his peace, his safety." Claire's eyes softened. "He deserves honesty more than safety built on lies." Margaret's hand trembled. "You'll ruin everything." Claire looked at her sadly. "It was already ruined, Maggie, you just never stopped pretending it was." Silence. Then a loud crack. Margaret's palm connected with Claire's cheek. Claire stumbled back, eyes wide. For a moment, both women froze, one gasping in shock, the other in horror at what she'd just done. Then Margaret dropped the paper, trembling, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean." But Claire backed away, voice shaking. "Get out, Maggie. Please. Get out." Margaret turned and fled, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She got into her car and drove, headlights slicing through the darkness, her sobs echoing in the confined space. She didn't notice the black SUV parked a few yards down the road, Daniel's car. He followed her. And now he'd seen everything. He waited until Margaret's taillights disappeared, then stepped out. The cabin door was half open. Inside, Claire sat at the table, tears running down her face. "Daniel," she whispered when she saw him. He froze. "It's you, you're alive." Claire nodded weakly. "I wanted to tell you, but I thought she'd stop if she believed I was gone." Daniel's chest tightened. "She didn't stop, she built a kingdom on your silence." Claire covered her face. "I know, I'm so sorry." Daniel looked at the scattered papers on the table: Margaret's forged confession, the slap mark on Claire's face, the broken woman who once held his heart. Something inside him hardened. "I'm done letting her decide who we are." Back in Willow Creek, Margaret's phone rang endlessly that night. She ignored it. She sat in the dark, holding one of Ethan's old drawings, stick figures of Mom, Dad, and me. She whispered, "He'll come home, he has to." But the phone kept ringing. When she finally answered, Daniel's voice was quiet but cold. "You need to come over." Her pulse quickened. "Is he okay?" He's fine, Daniel said, but we need to talk, all three of us. Her grip tightened, all three. Daniel paused, yes, Claire's here. The world seemed to tilt. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, that's impossible. She's alive, Maggie, Daniel said, and she remembers everything. Margaret's vision blurred, you don't understand what she did to me. I understand enough, Daniel cut in. You come here tonight if you ever want a chance to make this right. The line went dead. For a long time, Margaret sat frozen, staring into nothing. Then slowly she stood, her reflection in the window trembling under the moonlight. She wiped her tears, her face hardening into something cold and resolute. Fine, she whispered, if that's how it ends, we'll end it my way. She opened the drawer, reached inside, and took something wrapped in velvet, the last remnant of her father's old revolver. As she slipped it into her purse, the neighborhood lights flickered through the blinds. Margaret Langford, once the perfect president of Willow Creek, walked out of her house for the final time. And this time, she wasn't going to fix anything. She was going to finish it. Margaret drove through the winding forest road, her heart hammering in her chest. The moonlight glinted off the edges of her purse where the revolver rested, heavy and cold against her fingers. Every shadow in the trees seemed alive, every rustle whispering her sins back at her. She had crossed a line she could never come back from. Lake Marin shimmered in the distance, a silver ribbon cutting through the black night. She parked the car just beyond the cabin and approached cautiously, footsteps crunching on the gravel. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine, sharp and biting. Claire was there, sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes wide and alert. Daniel stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw tight. When they saw Margaret, neither moved, neither spoke. Silence stretched between them, tense and suffocating. Margaret swallowed hard. We need to talk, she said, voice brittle. Claire's eyes narrowed. We already talked, Maggie. You slapped me, you hit me, you don't get another conversation. Margaret stepped closer, ignoring Daniel's silent warning. You don't understand, I've given him everything, I've kept him safe when you could, I did what had to be done. You did what you wanted, Claire said quietly, her voice trembling. You didn't save him, you trapped all of us. Daniel moved a step forward, placing a protective hand on Claire's shoulder. Margaret, step back, whatever you think you're doing, it won't fix this. Margaret's grip tightened on the revolver inside her purse, her voice cracked. He's my son, I won't let you take him away. Ethan's small voice echoed behind them. Mom. All three turned and Margaret's breath caught. There he was, Ethan, clutching his favorite blanket, eyes wide with confusion and fear. His gaze flicked between the three adults, searching for clarity. Margaret stepped forward instinctively. Ethan, it's okay, I'm here. Daniel intervened, voice firm but gentle. No, Ethan, Mom, it's her, Claire is your mother. Margaret froze, the words were like ice in her veins. Claire stepped closer to Ethan, extending a hand. Hi, sweetheart, I'm Claire, I've always wanted to meet you. Ethan hesitated, then slowly he reached out. Margaret's chest constricted with a mix of fear and desperation. She took a step toward him, but Daniel's hand stayed on her shoulder, holding her back. No, Daniel said softly, this isn't your choice anymore. Margaret's hands shook. He doesn't know the truth, he can't understand. Claire knelt to meet Ethan's eyes. It's okay, honey, I'm not going to hurt you, I just want to know you. Ethan glanced back at Margaret. His expression wavered, confusion, love, fear, and loyalty all at once. His little hands twitched and then, quietly, he pulled toward Claire. Margaret stumbled back, her world shattering in slow motion. She felt the warmth in her chest being ripped away, leaving only cold emptiness. No, she whispered. Daniel shook his head. It's done, Margaret, he has to know who he is. Margaret's gaze flicked to the revolver in her purse. Her trembling hand reached inside, but something held her back. She looked at Ethan, so small and vulnerable, so pure in the middle of a storm she had created. Her finger hovered over the trigger and then, just as quickly, she pulled back. Tears blurred her vision, she sank to the ground, the purse falling beside her. I just wanted to protect him, she whispered. Claire stepped closer, kneeling beside her. I know, she said softly, but protection doesn't mean possession. Daniel looked at Margaret with a mixture of pity and anger. You've done enough damage already, it ends here. Margaret's lips quivered. She reached out a shaky hand toward Ethan, but he looked away, holding Claire's hand. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, letting go of the boy she had raised, the boy she had loved as her own, the boy who wasn't truly hers. The night air was still, heavy with tension and the unspoken truth of years. Margaret's chest heaved as she tried to breathe. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Finally, she looked at Daniel and Claire, her voice barely audible. "Take him, just promise me you'll keep him safe." Claire nodded, tears streaming. "Always." Ethan looked at Margaret one last time and she smiled through her tears. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a surrender, a farewell, and the recognition of her own mistakes. Margaret turned and walked away from the cabin, each step heavier than the last. Her hands were empty, her heart raw, but the storm inside her had begun to settle just enough to let her face the consequences of what she had done. She drove back through the winding forest road, the moonlight fading behind the trees. Behind her, the lake glistened, calm and indifferent, reflecting the first stars of the night. And in that reflection, Margaret realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Part 4: Redemption and Reckoning. Margaret returned to Willow Creek the next morning. The streets she once ruled now seemed foreign, every neighbor's glance carrying a question she didn't want to answer. She passed the mailbox cluster, the flowers in the yards, the familiar cul-de-sac where she had presided over countless HOA meetings. Everything was intact, and yet it was no longer hers. She parked her car in front of her house and sat for a long moment, staring at the front door. The revolver had been left at the lake, untouched. For the first time, she realized that fear and control had guided her for years, and that she had nearly destroyed everything she held dear in a desperate attempt to keep what wasn't hers. Her phone buzzed, a message from Claire. "He's happy, he's safe, it's over, Margaret." Margaret's hands shook as she read it. She didn't respond, she couldn't. For hours, she wandered through her home, touching objects that once gave her comfort: Ethan's old toys, his drawings, even the now empty bedroom. Each item was a reminder of love and loss, of mistakes and obsession. Later that afternoon, she drove to the local police station. She had to come clean: the forged papers, the deception, everything. Standing in the lobby, she felt the weight of her actions press down on her like 1,000 bricks. She approached the front desk. "I need to speak to an officer," she said, voice trembling. I have to confess something." The officer looked at her curiously but nodded. "Of course, ma'am, please have a seat, someone will be with you shortly." Margaret sat, her mind racing through every lie, every secret, every misstep. She knew she would lose more than her son. She might face jail, fines, and a complete ruin of her reputation. But for the first time in her life, honesty felt like the only path forward. When the officer finally led her into an interview room, she began, slowly, trembling, tearful. She admitted everything: the adoption papers, the forged signatures, the secrets she had kept from everyone, including Ethan. She spoke until her voice was raw, until she had nothing left to say. When she finished, the officer remained silent for a moment. "Ma'am," he finally said, "you've made serious mistakes, but it's clear that you acted out of misguided love. We'll need to investigate, but your cooperation will be noted." Margaret nodded, a mixture of relief and dread flooding through her. The road ahead was uncertain. The consequences were real. But for the first time, she had done the right thing. Meanwhile, at Lake Marin, Daniel and Claire watched Ethan play along the shore, skipping stones into the water. The boy laughed, free and unburdened, unaware of the storm his life had endured. Daniel glanced at Claire. "Do you think she'll ever forgive herself?" Claire shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but she has to live with it just as we've had to live with the consequences." Daniel nodded. Ethan ran up to them, holding a small stone in his hand. "Look, I made a wish." Claire knelt down, smiling. "What did you wish for, sweetheart?" Ethan grinned. "I wish that everyone could be happy." Daniel's eyes softened and Claire's heart ached. They knew that Margaret's path to redemption would be long and painful, but perhaps, in time, she could find peace. Back in Willow Creek, Margaret left the police station and drove home. She parked her car, walked up to her front door and paused. The neighborhood was quiet. She could hear children playing in distant yards, neighbors chatting, life moving forward without her interference. Margaret took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't undo the past. She couldn't reclaim Ethan. but maybe she could find a way to rebuild herself without lies, without control, without fear. She opened the door, stepped inside, and let it close gently behind her. For the first time in years, Margaret Langford sat alone in silence, not as a ruler, not as a protector, not as a liar, but as a human being confronting the truth, facing her mistakes, and beginning the slow journey toward forgiveness. Outside, the sun began to rise over Willow Creek, washing the streets in golden light. Life continued, messy and imperfect for everyone: Margaret, Daniel, Claire, and most of all, Ethan. And in that light, hope, fragile but real, began to grow.